We've been told time and time again that capitalism supports democracy, but we spend most of the day in a place where we have no vote. Our workplace. A democratic society needs to have democracy in the workplace. We are Democracy at Work, a worker-led, small donor-funded nonprofit making media that says we can do better than capitalism, an unjust economic system that is at odds with democracy. For us, critiquing the system isn't a taboo, it's a crucial step to a better world. Some of the most influential radical thinkers in America today host our free shows and author our books. With Democracy at Work, you can find different perspectives on class conflicts, the economy, and the impact of capitalism on our daily lives. Understand the root causes of the growing inequality all around us, and learn how democratic workplaces can shift power back into the hands of the majority in a real way. Our shows are free, with no ads, and our books are easy to understand. Our goal is to provide everyday people with simple explanations of ideas like Marxism and socialism, empowering you with the knowledge to create a more equitable future together. We seek a stronger, fuller democracy in and outside of the workplace. Watch, listen, or read Democracy at Work to learn how we can do better than capitalism. Hello, everyone. I am very excited to welcome you all to our very first Ask Prof Wolff live event, hosted by Democracy at Work. This Ask Prof Wolff series was designed to help us manage the staggering number of questions that we get for Professor Wolff, and to thank the monthly donors that make what we do at Democracy at Work possible. While we select questions that are submitted by our essential monthly donors for the video responses, we make sure that they're public so they're accessible to everyone. And just this year, we started releasing this video series in podcast form. So if you prefer to listen rather than watch video, be sure to search for Ask Prof Wolff on your preferred podcast platform. My name is Liz Phillips. I am the Democracy at Work co-managing and communications director. I'm going to be the moderator today, but I want to acknowledge everyone else behind the scenes helping me, my amazing team of colleagues, Maria, Maddie, and Eric. They're going to be helping me today. And for this event, for our questions, we are going to be selecting them from the YouTube chat or the YouTube comments. So please put your questions in there. We'll be looking through them and popping them up on screen for Professor Wolff to answer. It may not be possible for us to get to all the questions, of course. This is our first event. We're not quite sure the volume to expect here, but we're going to do our best to select questions, and Professor Wolff will do his best to answer them. We are going to be recording this event, so we'll publish it later. And if you didn't quite catch something, not to worry, you'll find it on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. And now I am very excited to introduce our invaluable Professor Richard Wolff. Hi, Rick. Thanks for doing this with us today.
My pleasure. I'm really glad to do this in a kind of live, ongoing way. Haven't done that before, so this is another way to reach folks, and that's what we're here for.
Excellent. Yeah, and now today we're trying out with this new format. Usually we collect questions submitted during the week, and then we send you a short list of about 6 to 8 of them, and then you review them and you choose 2 at the end that you'll answer. I mean, it starts from a big list to a short list, and you get time to frame those responses, and then you record them with Maddie or Maria. Does that sound about right? Did I miss anything there?
Nope, that's about how we do it.
Well, today we're going to, you won't have the advantage of preparation. And I know sometimes you kick yourself for not mentioning something you thought you should have or anything, but I can vouch for you that you're an old hat at answering questions on the fly. You are a lifelong professor after all. So, but today we'll try and find the balance between answering questions well and then answering as many as possible. So you have some extra slack today. Okay, so let's get started. This first one is going to come in from Michelle. So Michelle asks, Professor Wolff, can you discuss the concept of labor markets and how they influence collective bargaining power?
Sure. The notion of a labor market is the notion that at any given time in any economy, there are so and so many individuals, typically adults, able bodied adults, that are looking for work. That's considered the supply of labor. And there are so and so many employers looking to hire people, and that's considered the demand for labor. And so the relationship between how many people are looking on the one hand to find a job and how many employers are out there looking to find workers will determine the bargain between them. And that the outcome of that bargain is what we call the wage or the salary. If, for example, the supply is very large, lots of people looking for jobs, well, that's going to put the hiring process pretty much in the hands of the employer. The employer knows there's a lot of folks looking for work, so I can offer relatively lower wages than I might have to if the number of people looking was scarce, was small. So it's important to know the supply and demand for labor because it gives you a very good idea of how the bargaining, how the collective bargaining between workers, if they're acting collectively, for example, in a union, and how that will work with the employer to set the all important question of the wage. And so that's why we kind of pay attention to it. A final way of getting a sense of it is that the market for labor, the supply and demand for labor, is not something that the employers or the workers simply accept as a fact of nature, like, it's raining on Thursday, so we have to remember an umbrella. No, no, no. It is something both sides try to manipulate. They want the supply and demand of labor to go well for them. So the employer likes to limit the demand and increase the supply, because then he's got desperate workers, people who are looking for work, a lot of them. There may not be enough jobs. And so the employer's in a position to get you to work for less money than it would be if the roles were reversed. And workers, for the same reason, try to limit the supply of labor and expand the demand to get the reverse result, to get their wages to be higher. And you kind of all know what the employers do because they have the resources, the money, the wealth, the profits from their business to manipulate labor markets. And here are some of the most famous ways that they do that. Number one, automation. They replace workers with machines. That means the workers who used to have a job don't have one because the machine took their place. They therefore are added to the people out there looking for work, and that means every other employer has what he wants: excess supply of workers. The second thing employers like to do is move jobs overseas. Same reason. When you move the job out of Cincinnati to Shanghai, well, that means the people who used to have the job in Cincinnati are added to the people looking for work. And that puts the employer in the better bargaining position. And the third one is perhaps the one you're most attuned to these days, given US politics. And that is bringing people into the country from outside, immigrants. That adds to the supply of labor. Corporations are quite presently, and in most of our history, quite eager to have immigrants. The workers who watch the immigrants come in, who see that the employer can sometimes pay less to an immigrant, at least initially, and get away with it, You then are not so surprised if workers who either have that experience or fear that they might have that experience can be captured by anti-immigrant politicians because they think they need to protect themselves for what the employers are doing with immigration, which is using it to reduce wages. So it's a constant contest. That's the best way to understand it. Who gets to manipulate the labor supply and the labor demand? The market for labor will determine whether the wage is better for the worker or better for the employer, and it's a constant struggle between them over that.
Exhausting. Ugh, can we move on from this already? Well, let's move on to the next question. I want to bring in, this is anonymous, but the question is, fascism is when the state and corporations merge. So why isn't the system that China has considered fascist? Why isn't the system that China has considered fascist? Is it fascist or is it not?
Good. That's an important question, and I'm going to interpret it to mean what is fascism, and then what's the relationship between fascism on the one hand and places like China, where there is something that looks, in at least some ways, like fascism. All right, let's begin. The classic explanation of fascism uses the modern examples that call themselves fascists. And those are mostly Nazi Germany and Mussolini's fascist Italy. There are other examples, but those are the key emblematic symptoms of this system. And here's what it means in economics. It has meanings outside and beyond economics, but I'm an economist. That's what I focus on. And I think that's the core of fascism, so we can focus on it. Here's what it is. It's when you don't have the arm's length distance ideologically, politically, in every way, between the government on the one hand and the enterprises on the other. Typically, this happens out of one or the other of these kinds of historical situations. Situation number one, and this is what applied to Germany and to Italy. You have a situation where capitalists, the employer class, and remember, employers, capitalists, never more than 1, maybe 1.5% of the population anywhere. The vast majority in modern capitalism are always the employees, not the employers. But sometimes employers have a hard time getting employees to work for them, getting employees to accept the working conditions, to accept the wages and salaries. And then the employers have to do things to try to fix the problem, persuading people, if they can, come to work, using the difficulties people have if they don't have an income by saying to them, come to work and we'll pay you and you'll have some income. But sometimes the mass of the working people are so angry at the way they're treated, so bitter about the wages they're expected to live on, that they refuse, that they begin to say, no, you've got to give us more wages or else we're not going to come. That's what a strike is, after all. And a strike is only one way that workers express their views. Right now in the United States, we have a wave of what's called quiet quitting. No strikes, but workers simply saying, we're not doing this anymore. We're going to find another way to live, and we're not going to go work for some employer. We've been there, we've done that, we've had it, no more. When employers can't figure out any successful, peaceful way to get the workers to come and do the work, in an extreme situation for them like that, when they discover a basic lessons of economics, you can have the most beautiful factory or office building or store. You can have all the latest equipment. You can have all of that. But if you don't have the working man and woman coming in there to do the work, you have nothing. You have a bunch of scrap. You don't earn a profit. Your business will die. You depend on the employees, without which it's all pretend. They learn that lesson, but they're unable to persuade folks to come. They turn to the government, and here comes the hard part, and they want the government to force it, to literally force people to come to work. And then you see a kind of merger between the government on the one hand and the corporations, the capitalists, the employer class on the other. The politicians say, we'll help you, we'll make sure it all works, but you've got to support us and give us the power and the resources to do what you want. Well, let me give you an example. When Hitler comes to power in Germany in January of 1933, one of the first things he does is go after destroying the labor movement. Why? Because it's the unions that have been making trouble for the employers, making it hard for them to pay low wages, organizing strikes, organizing refusal to work, organizing slowdowns on the job, and in general, advocating, which is after all what a union's supposed to do, for the workers, not for the employer. And the government comes in and does the employers an enormous favor. In the case of the Nazis, they hounded the unions. They arrested and imprisoned union leaders, made up charges, or wrote new laws that made the union illegal, whereas before it had been legal, replacing existing unions with new ones thrown together by the Nazi Party and being given the official position so that the real unions were pushed out of the picture. In those ways and in many others, the government becomes, think of it this way, the enforcer, the one who makes capitalism work when no peaceful, legal, conventional way of doing it worked. And so you then see what happened in Nazi Germany. The Nazis replaced all the unions. The Nazis destroyed socialist parties, labor parties, communist parties, as well as unions. They took care of business so that the German working class was told by the employer and by the government official standing right next to him, you better do what we want you to do, or not only will you have no job, not only will you have no income, but the government and the police and the military are going to be on you like white on rice, and you better react. And the working classes of Italy and Germany, with resistance, nonetheless caved in because of this kind of powerful system. It built resistance over time. You know, it didn't last all that long, neither in Italy nor in Germany, but it got them over the hump of a very difficult position. But that's not the only way governments and business can merge. Here's another one. And the prime example of that is the Soviet Union and a version of that in China. So let me talk about how it's similar but different all at the same time. Quickly, the similarity. Workers make a revolution. They take the industries away from the employers. That's what happened in Russia, 1917. And here's what the workers did. They set up their own government. Just like with fascism, the employers replaced people's institutions with the government. In the case of socialism, the workers get rid of the employers and replace them with the government, controlled by the workers. And that acts in the opposite way to make things better for workers at the expense of employers. And that kind of situation has the apparent similarity, government and business close together. But the real difference is in fascism, the closeness with business is with the employers, whereas in socialism, the closeness of the government is with workers' organizations like unions, socialist and communist parties. And that makes them different across the board.
Great. Thank you. This is super thorough in such a short time. You have a knack for this, Rick. You might be doing this professionally or something, right?
Yeah, I try.
All right. Well, I've got a new question coming in from Jonathan, who asks, is inflation is it a result of employers increasing prices to make higher profits? And how does the Fed connect the interest rate as a way to directly control inflation?
All right, great question. Obviously, it's a question of this moment that we are all living through. So let's begin with inflation. The short answer to your question, and I'm trying to be as brief as I can, is yes, employers raising prices have a lot to do with inflation. And I smile when I say that because this is a basic lesson in economics. Employers are the people to whom we give, in a capitalist system, the power and the authority to set prices, to raise them or lower them or leave them the same. Employees, the vast majority of us, 99+% of us are employees if we work in a job. We do not have the power to set prices. I've been an employee in various institutions all my life. No employer ever invited me into his or her office to work on the question, will we be raising the price of what we produce in this business? Will we be lowering it? No. That the employer keeps as the prerogative exclusively of the employers. So the only way we have an inflation, and by the way, the definition of inflation, a general rise in prices. Not every price goes up the same, but a general rise. The only people who could do that are employers. The government doesn't set prices for the goods and services that are produced in our society, and the employees don't either. So it's the employer. So the first thing you want to do if you are analyzing an inflation is realize that the real question to explain an inflation is this one. Why are employers making the decision to generally raise prices? And the answer to that obvious question is pretty obvious too. Everything employers do in order to make their businesses successful is done in order to improve the profitability. I've taught courses in business schools, for example, and the business school teaches young men and women who go to school how to make judgments about everything. Do you hire someone? Do you buy another truck? Do you expand overseas? Do you change your technology? The answer to all those questions is the same. What is the impact on profits? If the proposed action raises profits, you do it. And if the proposed action threatens or damages profits, you know not to do it. So now we've got it. You know why prices are going up? Because businesses have decided that is a profitable strategy to undertake. And in case you had any doubts, if you look at the last 18 months during which we've now had quite an inflation, you will also see that corporate profits are going off the chart up. Yeah, raising prices is a way to make more money in the last couple of years, and that's the basic reason why we've got it. Now, the second part of your question. What is the Federal Reserve doing? Well, in my judgment, I do this for a living, the Federal Reserve is doing something very strange. It has decided not only to raise interest rates as the way to bring down the inflation, And by the way, they're worried about the inflation for two reasons. Number one, the mass of people in America can't keep up. The overwhelming majority of us are not seeing our income rise currently at the rate of 8 or 9% a year, which it would have to for us to be able to afford the same goods we bought last year that now cost 8 or 9% more. So most Americans are not in that position. Therefore, most Americans are being hurt by the inflation. The second reason, probably more important, as prices go up in the United States, the whole rest of the world starts looking for other substitutes for buying goods from America, places that they can go to where the prices haven't risen 8 or 9%. And by the way, don't be fooled by politicians wanting to get you to think in a peculiar way by telling you something which is a lie, namely that, oh, inflation, that's not a problem of the United States alone, that's everywhere. Not true. I'll give you two examples. I'll give you the example of Japan and China. Both of them have inflations in the neighborhood of 1 or 2% a year, not 8 or 9. And those are huge, important countries. So we have a particular problem. As the prices go up, foreigners go elsewhere to buy goods and services. They don't buy American goods because they're all 8 or 9% higher each year. They go elsewhere. And if we can't sell our goods abroad, our exports, we lay off people here, which is beginning to happen because then no one's going to hire them here to produce what you can't sell abroad because your inflation is jacking up the prices. So for all those reasons, the Federal Reserve comes in. We got to do something about the inflation. I won't mention that Mr. Biden and the Democrats are worried about the election a few weeks from now because they see that the inflation may drive people to the other political party. Raising interest rates has a simple logic. It makes it more expensive to buy a home. It makes it more expensive to buy a car and pay on time. It makes it more expensive to use your credit card, and it makes it more expensive for students to borrow to go to school. In all those cases, people will do less spending on anything because it's too expensive to borrow the money they need to make those expenditures. So the idea is if you make it harder for people to buy goods and services, you make it less likely for the employer class to raise prices because they see they're already losing business. If they raise prices, they risk losing more. So it's the idea you kind of stifle the demand for goods and services as a way to persuade the employer maybe not to raise prices. Why am I critical? And why I think you ought to be as well? Because this is not the only way to deal with an inflation. In fact, it's not a very good way. It often doesn't work, and it is awfully soft on the employer when it's the employer's decision to raise the prices which give us the inflation problem in the first place. So what else could the Federal Reserve do? I'm going to give you one of many examples. In 1971, a Republican conservative president, Richard Nixon, facing an inflation worse than the one that we have now, went on radio and television, 15th of August, 1971, and he said the following, I'm paraphrasing. We have a terrible inflation. We have to bring it to a stop. I don't want to take a long time to do it. So here's what we're going to do. As of tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, any business in America, any office, any store, any factory that raises the price of anything, we will come, we will arrest you, and you will go to jail. And any union that raises the wages or tries to, we will do the same. This came to be called a wage price freeze. It was originally put in place for 90 days. It was extended. And you know why? It stopped the inflation on a dime. It was a very effective program done by a conservative Republican. And I will leave it to you to try to explain to yourself, your mother, your father, and your brother why a Democratic president not only won't do that, but that he and Mr. Powell at the head of the Federal Reserve will not even discuss it, will not have a debate in our country. Look at the pros and cons of a wage price freeze versus the pros and cons of raising interest rates. And here's the last point. Raising interest rates hurts, of course, the same people the inflation does, the poorest amongst us. The middle and lower income people are the ones having the hardest time as prices go up. They're the ones who are going to have the hardest time paying the rising interest rates. What kind of an economic system wants the majority to support it when the majority are the ones hurt by the inflation the employers impose, and then hurt by the government policy that's supposed to deal with the inflation that the employers impose? It's a system which, pardon me for repeating it to you, we can do better than that, and we should have begun doing that long ago.
Hear, hear. Well, we've got some more questions in the wings. Before we get to them really quickly, I'd just like to remind everyone that this is a live Ask Prof Wolff produced by Democracy at Work. And we are really thankful to the generous monthly donors that make our work possible, especially the ones who are attending the event today. And for people watching the recording later, you can go to democracyatwork.info/donate to learn about all the ways that you can support our work. While you're there, it's really quick and easy to sign up to our mailing list. It's one of the best ways to stay connected to us and to learn about future events like this. And we've got an upcoming announcement about a really exciting event featuring Professor Richard Wolff and Professor David Harvey next month. So do stay tuned. We will be announcing more details about that shortly. Okay, let's move on to the next question. This one comes from Dan. Dan asks, in a worker cooperative society, what would be the role of or major functions of the state?
Really good question. You know, in every society where there was a state of some sort, it was an open question. What would the state do? What would the state's limits be? When would the state cross those limits? And what would the society do if and when it did that? Many people believe that the state itself is an institution that we may or may not need. And by need, I mean, what is it there to do? Is it the best way to get that done? And if the answer to those questions are, we can do it without the government, then I think most people's experience of the human experience over the last many millennia is that if we could get it done with less or no government, that's probably the way to go. There's a little bit of anarchism in all of us, if you think about it. But let me respond to the direct question about what a state might be asked to do in a worker co-op society. Since the whole fundamental principle of worker co-ops is to bring democracy into the workplace with this peculiar recognition, why didn't we do that in the beginning? Why did we limit the idea, for example, of having leaders elected by those they lead, being accountable in that way, being removable in that way? We did that in the neighborhoods where we live, in our city, in our town, in our village, in our state, in our nation. Why didn't we do it at work? If democracy is the great value we mostly say it is, then it ought to have been where we spend most of our adult lives. 5 out of 7 days, by and large, most of our adult lives, when we're not sick or in some other institution. We do that without demanding democracy. The people who hire us and have enormous power over us are not accountable. And that's what democracy at work is about. We want to do that. If workers were to run the enterprises, which is the idea we have of the change we need, then everything that a government does would now suddenly be at an arm's distance from the daily life. We would be running our own daily life. In capitalism, that was never possible. And let me show you why. The capitalists are a very small number of people. As I said a few moments ago, 1%, if that, are employers. The rest of us are employees or dependencies of employees. So it often happens that if 1%, a tiny proportion of the people, have all the power, they're the ones who own and operate the enterprises. 10% of our people own 80% of the shares of stock of our companies. The people who are sitting on a board of directors, 10 to 20 individuals, and there can be tens of thousands of employees under them. So whenever you have a tiny group of people with the power and the dominant wealth that we know the employer class has in capitalism, as it surely does here in the United States, it is no surprise that periodically the mass of people who are excluded from that wealth, who are excluded from the power to decide what to produce, what technology to use, where to produce things, how to distribute the wealth, there's going to be tension. And in that tension, the employees have the majority and the employers a tiny minority. And you know what employers do? They do the same thing every minority has ever done in history when it is set up like this. What masters do when there's a lot of slaves, what lords do in feudalism when there's a lot of serfs. You need a government apparatus that has a monopoly of power, guns, planes, jails, courts, all the apparatus to keep the mass of people from demanding what their sheer numbers give them the power and the idea to demand. The government becomes a massive, repressive institution, not because there's something intrinsic about government that make them act that way. They often don't. But it's the society that builds the government whose needs and contradictions and tensions can make a government function. And I think the honest answer to your question is it will be the worker co-ops together with the residences, the democracy where you live, which will have to coordinate with the democracy where you work in a worker co-op based economy. Those two democracies will decide what the state is there for, what we need it for, what we no longer need it for. We're not going to have in a worker co-op a tiny group of people telling everybody else what to do and becoming wealthy while everybody else does it. We're not going to have that problem, and we're not going to need a state to keep the lid on that kind of a tension, envy, bitterness based system as we have today. We may need some coordinations among worker co-ops, some entity that can be for everybody, helping when one co-op has a problem to help it solve that problem. If it can't solve that problem, move people from one worker co-op to another in a way that doesn't interrupt their income, that keeps them where they want to live with their families, where their children go to school. In other words, we can have a government that serves in a radically different way because we have changed the society. And we shouldn't be hesitant about that. States have not been the same. Ancient Greece and Rome did not have states the way we do now. The medieval period didn't have it in Europe. Capitalists have a different kind of relationship to the state, and a new economic system based on democratic worker co-ops will carve out its own way to determine whether it wants a state and what it wants that state to do and not to do. And that little bit of anarchism that we all have, that will also play a role in making sure that state cannot be a part of an oppressive apparatus. And the way you do that is get rid of the oppressive relationships within the workplace, because that has been a crucial cause of what has made us all have a little bit of anarchism deep inside us.
I was giggling when you said that. I got a very clear image of, like, instead of just the angel and the devil, there's also like the little anarchist maybe somewhere up here. Okay, thanks for that. Here's another question. This one comes in from Crafty Geek. The question is, what is the major historical downsides to a deflation? Are price decreases in a specific sector, example fuel, if hypothetically the shocks to that supply chain end some time, are they generally isolated from these?
Yes, this is a question about deflation, and it's a good one to pose, even though right now we have the opposite problem of inflation. As I said earlier, inflation is when prices generally rise. Deflation is when prices generally fall. There are a whole host of reasons why that can happen, and there are a whole host of problems set in motion when there's a deflation. Let me just illustrate so you get an idea. When the prices of things are falling, your problem is, as a human being, that you are constantly being incentivized, given a reason not to buy things. In other words, once you get the idea, oh, we're in a deflation, prices are coming down, then when you and your friends are discussing, let's see, I need to buy a car, you're going to come to the conclusion, don't rush. Maybe waiting a couple of months or half a year, you can get that same car for way less than you would have to pay now, because deflation means prices are going down. So what it tends to do is lead all purchasers, all buyers of things, you, me, businesses, to postpone, to hold back. And that's what's called a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if we start to hold back, expecting prices to fall, businesses everywhere are going to discover, oh my goodness, people are not buying. They're holding back. They're expecting prices to fall. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to try to coax them to come and buy by offering to drop the price right away. You don't have to wait 2 months or 6 months. I'll do it right now. And they do it, and their competitors go, oh my gosh, everybody's going to go to them because they got the jump and they cut the price. I'll match that. I'll cut it a little bit more. In other words, the very deflation idea, as it settles into people's mind, makes the deflation worse and worse and worse. And consider what happens to people who don't have any cash, because cash becomes king in a deflation. If you hold your wealth in land or buildings or things like that, as prices go down, the value of your wealth goes down. But if you had sold before the deflation hit, you had sold your land and sold whatever wealth you had, and you sat on a pile of cash, it would become more valuable with the passage of every day. Why? Because as prices go down, whatever cash you have enables you to buy more and more. And so you keep waiting. You're not going to jump in because time is on your side. Time is making everything you can do with your cash more valuable than it was. And it really leads to decisions by businesses, by individuals, by governments, radically different, because everyone is now trying to game the system's falling prices just the way that right now everybody's trying to figure out how to game the economy with the prices going up. It's so disruptive that you can see the effort of the government. For example, the Federal Reserve, established 100 years ago in the United States with these objectives. This is what the Federal Reserve is there for. Number one is the language they use: maintain price stability. In other words, don't have an inflation and don't have a deflation, because they are so disruptive. If in terms of your question, they're just as disruptive as a sudden shock to the system of any kind, like the sanctions that the United States, Britain, and Europe and Japan have imposed on Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. Those sanctions said suddenly that Europe, in particular, wouldn't be buying gas and oil from Russia the way they used to. They wouldn't pay for it, or they'd pay less for it. There's a whole host of sanctions at various points. The Russians responded with counter sanctions. The end result was that the price of oil and gas has gone through the roof. This has staggering consequences because everybody's trying to figure out what to do under these different strange circumstances. That's exactly what happens with a deflation. As prices go down, everybody's adjusting. And you can see the kind of impact it has by looking again at the impact of this move against Russia with the sanctions and the Russian response with their counter sanctions. We have the price of energy, a major stimulus to the inflation. We have the price of energy destroying right now, as I speak to you, the economy of Germany. Germany was the most dependent on Russian gas, as it has been for decades, and oil. And the price of German exports, it's an export economy, depended on their prices being attractive. That's why everybody bought German machines and so forth. With the price of energy having gone through the roof, tripling or quadrupling in a matter of months in Germany, as I speak to you. Now, German exports are too expensive. They can't sell. Their exports have collapsed, and Germany, from being the power economy of Europe, is now looking like the sick economy of Europe, transforming European politics, the world calculations, American foreign policy. Everything is now unstable as a result. A deflation would have even greater, because it's not narrowly limited to one or two commodities. It's a general disruption of normality. Now, I would urge you to ask a question you will not see in the mainstream media, which is, why are we holding on to an economic system that functions this way? Inflation now, deflation then, unemployment, rising interest. This is an unstable economic system. And if you put it together with the every 4 to 7 year crashes we've had, and you put that together with the inequality we've also been talking about, you have an unstable, unequal system, and there ought to be a debate. Can't we do better than that? And my answer would be, sure we can. We just have to have the courage to ask the question, have the conversation, and know that we won't be any worse off by having the conversation, and we may figure out a better system. And that's what makes human progress what it can be.
Yep, and we hope that these little tidbits, these little question responses can help drive that conversation so we can really face these really important topics. I want to pull in another question that I think kind of is good to piggyback off of this, because it helps analyze how we're doing right now. So here's this question from David, who asks, Prof Wolff, I think the condition of public goods is correlated with a society's democratic health. What do you think about this?
Yes, I agree. And I think that there's a deep wisdom in all of this. We are a people, we Americans, and I count myself, I was born in Youngstown, Ohio, for those of you who don't know, right in the middle of the United States, a kind of emblem of what happened to capitalism. It was a thriving place when I was born. My mother and father earned a decent living, could provide for me, and all the rest. It's a disaster ever since. The decline of the automobile industry, the decline of the steel industry from Youngstown that fed the car production in Detroit and so on. For decades, it's been a decline. The people of Youngstown have struggled to hold on, but it's been very, very hard. And one of the reasons for all of this is that we here in the United States have an anxiety about almost everything collective. We want to be individuals. We want to pose our problems individually and solve them individually. We're suspicious of collective activity. And I think we've taken that way too far. I think there's a place to respect the individual, absolutely important. And there are cases in history where individuals haven't gotten the respect that they should have been. Agreed. But the same applies to collective. And here's the question that asks us about it in economics. What is the difference between collective consumption and individual consumption? Well, let me do it with examples. Collective consumption is the public park in the middle of your community, if you have one, as most communities do. It is a place with a lawn and trees and maybe a little pond where what? Where anybody can go when they feel like it, when they have a moment, spread a blanket on the lawn, have a picnic with friends, etc. It's a collective resource that's available for everybody. And one of the reasons communities do it is because it is infinitely cheaper to make collective consumption goods like a park than to give the equivalent experience to each individual individually. It's the same difference as exists, for example, between the cost of heating your own private home versus the cost of heating your apartment in an apartment complex. One is very different from the other. We are going in the years ahead, given our climate problems, we're going to be living in more collective arrangements, partly because we have to. We can't keep fouling the environment the way we have. We have to burn less in the way of fuels, and as well as shifting to renewables and all the rest. But collective consumption has another value. It brings people together. It makes it possible for us not to be as lonely as this society has become. We interact. We learn how to be different. We learn that people can be different and that can be exciting to learn from and interact, to learn how they're different from us, to teach how we're different from them, and to learn that we can do things together that are not available if we're going to do it all by ourselves. I remember when I learned as a child about how barns were built in Ohio in the early days. It was too difficult, too hard, too long, too expensive to build a barn on your own. So every couple of weeks, everybody in the village would go to a different family's home, and there'd be the weekend to build the Jones family their barn. We did it all together. All the Barneses had to do was to provide picnics and sandwiches and beer, and everybody built the barn. And 2 weeks later, we went to the Smith's household. And 2 weeks later, it came to our household. And it wasn't just that we built many more barns that way than we could have, because most of the families couldn't have afforded the time and the money to build the barn themselves. But we could do it collectively. And you know something? The feelings that developed as we got to know each other every other week, working on the barns for one another, was priceless, had an awful lot to do with the sense of community and solidarity that these experiences gave us. Yeah, collective consumption is when you consume collectively. Obviously, there are some things that you're not going to do collectively, like have a toothbrush or lots of other things that are properly done. But a rational society, knowing what the loneliness costs are medically, psychologically, and so on, knowing what the financial savings might be, would have a democratic discussion about how much and what kinds of consumption we want to have individual and which ones we want to have collective. And that could be the very process of democratically debating it, and then after a while reopening it, because situations change and people may want a different mix. A democratic workplace, a democratic society would answer the question that way, by looking at the concrete costs and benefits of these two kinds of consumption. Last thing, we already have lots of collective consumption. I didn't mean for anyone to suggest to anyone that a public park is the only example. The fire department is an example. We could each take care of the fire problem ourselves, hire somebody who will be there, we hope, when a fire breaks out, we hope, and get there quickly, we hope. Or, and that would be very expensive, and it would mean what? That the poorest amongst us wouldn't do it because they didn't have the money. So their house would burn to the ground. And you know what that might mean? That the fire would spread. And you know what that might mean? Might get to your house. In other words, collective consumption is what we have been doing for centuries. We have a fire department in each village, each town, each neighborhood. The police is another example. Public health services are another example. Public schools are another example. We already do a lot with collective consumption, and we would do much more were it not for the fact that because we have a private capitalist economy, there are always employers looking to make a buck by providing privately as a commodity what we have been buying before as a collective consumption. And that always puts collective consumption kind of under the gun. And we ought to be aware of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and your local park might reflect that, just how under the gun it is. I want to bring in this one really last question. We're about out of time, but I thought this is a good note to end on. This question comes from Paul. Is capitalism a religion? Has it become an established religion of the United States? Which is kind of funny in that make you want to cry way. But we only have a few minutes left. But if you want to briefly answer this one, Rick.
Yeah, a brief answer is yes. And the thought has occurred to many, many people that the religion of capitalism, unlike the religion of feudalism or the religions of slavery, really wasn't over there as a separate thing. It became internalized. When I hear people talking about the magic of the market, I substitute the word God. The market is given the power of somehow magically making everything work out. The powers we normally associate with gods or goddesses, we give to the market, a capitalist institution, if ever there was one. So, yeah, I think for many Americans, the phrase the almighty dollar kind of gives it away, that you put those two things together that way, that the dollar is almighty. And that's one of the reasons we don't criticize capitalism the way we criticize every other institution in our society. We criticize our schools, our medical care system, our parks system, our you name it. But when it comes to capitalism, there's a notion of a taboo, that this can't be criticized. It's beyond all of that. And then we have this almighty dollar that an awful lot of us bend down to when a little bit of thought would indicate probably not a good idea.
Yeah. Well, at Democracy at Work, you can get all your blasphemy needs met, I guess, in this case. So thank you. That's all we're going to have time for today. But thank you, everyone, for participating and offering up such great questions. Thank you so much to the generous and engaged audience that makes our work possible. I encourage everyone to visit our website to not only make use of the resources there. We've got a new co-ops page, which has a lot of good information there if you're interested in what we can do beyond capitalism, but also ways to stay connected with us and learn about future events. Hint, hint, Harvey and Rick Wolff coming together next month. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much, Rick, for giving us your time today.
My pleasure. Interacting with people and having these discussions, that's what I live for that. I enjoy it, and I appreciate, as Liz has said to you so well, that we're all together and able to do this. And I hope to see you again when these events continue in the months ahead.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you, Rick.
Bye-bye.